Welcome to the deep dive. We like to really get into the details here, and today we're taking on a big one, something that's, well, kind of fundamental to how we learn, especially when we're talking about those fields that really make you think: science, tech, engineering, all that STEM stuff.
You got it. STEM learning. And for this deep dive, you've brought a ton of research, decades of it actually, about spatial ability.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we're going to unpack it all. We're going to figure out why this thing, this way of thinking, this visual thinking, why it's so important, especially in those STEM fields. But we're not stopping at just a definition.
No simple definitions today. We're going deeper. We want to break it down, see all the parts, all the pieces that make up spatial ability.
It's like one of those exploded diagrams, where you see all the parts laid out and how they fit together. That's what we're doing with spatial ability.
I like that analogy, exploding spatial ability to see all its inner workings. And I think the best place to start is with the so what. Why should anyone care about this stuff? Why does spatial ability even matter, especially in STEM?
Right. It might seem a little niche, a little out there, but trust me, by the end of this deep dive, you'll be seeing spatial ability everywhere. In your own thinking, in the way you solve problems, in how you understand the world.
It really is everywhere once you start to see it. And the research is super clear. There's this strong, proven link between how well someone does on those spatial ability tests and how well they do in STEM education. And it's not just like, oh, you're good at spatial stuff, you'll generally do well in sciencey things. It's way more specific than that.
Yeah, give us some specifics.
This link pops up again and again in particular subjects. Biology, chemistry, physics, obviously math, even in areas like computer programming, design, engineering, graphics, geometry, and the whole massive field of engineering.
That's a pretty extensive list.
Yeah.
And it's not just a flash in the pan, right? It's not like you do well in a single class and then it's gone. This research shows that spatial ability has staying power, that it affects people over years.
Exactly. And that long-term impact is what makes it so important. Think about this. There was this study back in 2001 by Shea and his colleagues. They followed a group of incredibly bright students, like top tier, the top 0.5%.
The cream of the crop.
Right, the best of the best. And they tracked them, and what they found was amazing. These students' spatial ability, measured when they were only 13 years old, was a strong predictor of whether they would go on to get degrees in STEM fields and actually work in those fields as adults.
So basically, how well they did on some visual thinking tests as young teenagers gave a clue about their future career paths. That's pretty wild.
It is, and what's even crazier is that their spatial ability scores were a better predictor of STEM success than their scores on those standardized tests, the ones that everyone stresses about.
So we're talking SATs, ACTs, all those big exams. Their spatial scores were more predictive than those.
More predictive. This specific kind of visual thinking, this ability to manipulate shapes and images in your head, was a more powerful indicator of their future STEM paths than their general academic scores.
That makes you wonder what we should be focusing on in those early years of education, right? Maybe we need to rethink what we consider important.
Absolutely. It challenges some of those traditional assumptions about what predicts success. And then there's another study from 2007, this one by Webb and his team. They looked at a slightly larger group of high-achieving students, the top 3%, so still really bright kids.
So similar to Shea's study, but a slightly wider range.
Exactly. And what they found was like an echo of Shea's work. Over a 5-year period, they saw that spatial ability predicted these students' preferences for STEM courses, the kinds of STEM-related things they did for fun in their free time, what they chose to major in college, and even the career paths they imagined for themselves.
So we see this link between spatial ability and STEM interests play out in the long term, in their choices about how they spend their time, what they study, and where they see themselves going professionally.
Exactly. And again, they took those standardized test scores into account, and still, spatial ability was a strong predictor.
Okay, so we have these studies showing a pretty consistent connection between spatial ability and a bunch of things related to STEM. But what about the bigger picture? How does this hold up when we look at a much larger, more diverse group of people?
Well, that's where the Project Talent data comes in. Wadey and a few other researchers did this huge analysis in 2009 using data from Project Talent. This was a massive study, like a random sample of high school students across the U.S. And they followed these students for 11 years after they graduated.
11 years, wow. That's a long time to track people. So what did they find about spatial ability?
Their analysis really hammered home the importance of spatial ability for success in STEM. Across this huge, diverse group of people, those who had stronger spatial abilities tended to achieve more in STEM fields later on. But here's the interesting thing. They also noticed that spatial ability seemed less important in the humanities and social sciences.
That's fascinating. That difference between STEM and non-STEM fields
Hmm.
really suggests that there's something unique about the kind of thinking and problem solving you do in STEM, something that really relies on those spatial skills.
Right. It's not that spatial ability is completely irrelevant outside of STEM, but the connection seems much stronger in those areas. And that observation really drives home the main message from all this research. As Y and Lubieski, another researcher who's done a lot of work in this area, have pointed out, spatial ability is like this key characteristic of people who go on to get advanced degrees in STEM fields and have successful STEM careers.
So it's not just about getting good grades in school, it's about something deeper, something that helps you really learn and develop real expertise in these fields.
It's about how you think, how you process information, how you solve problems, and all of that is tied to spatial ability.
Okay, so the what is pretty clear. Spatial ability is a big deal for STEM. It predicts success, and that connection lasts a long time. But then there's this huge question, the why. We see the correlation, but what's the explanation? What's actually going on in our brains that makes spatial abilities so important for STEM learning and problem solving?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And to answer it, we need to go beyond just the general idea of spatial ability and really dissect it. We need to understand what we're actually talking about when we say someone is good or bad at spatial stuff. What are the specific abilities, the cognitive tools that make up this thing we call spatial ability?
Which brings us to the challenge of defining spatial ability itself. And as the review points out, this hasn't always been easy for researchers to agree on.
Yeah, it's been a moving target. Historically, there hasn't always been this clear, universally accepted definition. If you go way back, like to the late 1800s, you find people like Galton, a super influential scientist. He described it as this visualizing faculty.
Visualizing faculty, so the ability to picture things in your mind.
Exactly. He emphasized this idea of creating and manipulating mental images, like being able to see things clearly in your head, to examine them from different angles, even to invent new images based on descriptions you hear or read. Kind of like an artist might work.
That's a pretty intuitive way to think about it. And it makes sense, right? A lot of STEM involves visualizing things that you can't necessarily see or touch directly.
Right, like molecules or magnetic fields or complex systems. But as research got more sophisticated, particularly with the development of factor analysis, the way we define spatial ability started to change. People like Spearman, Thurstone, and Carroll, pioneers in the field of intelligence research, they started using statistics to identify the underlying building blocks of intelligence.
Factor analysis, it's a whole other rabbit hole we could go down. But
Yeah.
basically, it's about using data to figure out how different mental abilities are related to each other.
Exactly. And this statistical approach led to more data-driven definitions of spatial ability. Instead of just relying on observations and descriptions, researchers could analyze how people performed on different mental tasks and use that data to tease apart the underlying cognitive factors.
So we move from those early intuitive ideas to more evidence-based definitions.
Exactly. And that shift brought us to the model we use today, the Cattle-Horn-Carroll theory, or CHC theory for short. It's kind of like the gold standard for understanding human intelligence. And within this model, spatial ability is recognized as a major player. It's considered a second-order factor, which means it's like one of the big branches on the intelligence tree.
So it's not just a little twig, it's one of the main branches. And it's often called the G factor, or visual processing, right?
That's right. GIVE, or visual processing. And the CHC theory actually gives us a formal definition: the ability to make use of simulated mental imagery, often in conjunction with currently perceived images, to solve problems.
So it's about using those mental images, those pictures in your mind, to figure things out, often while also looking at real images or objects. That seems to connect those early ideas about mental imagery with this more modern focus on problem solving.
Right. It brings those two things together. But, and here's the important part, the real testable definition of spatial ability within the CHC framework lies in the first-order factors. These are the more specific abilities, the individual cognitive tools, that fall under that big umbrella of REIV, of visual processing.
So it's like breaking down that big branch into smaller, more specific twigs. Each of those twigs is a different spatial ability that we can measure and study. And those specific abilities are what we're going to explore now, right?
Precisely. We need to understand those specific abilities to really grasp how spatial thinking contributes to STEM learning.
Okay, let's get into those specifics. The review groups these first-order spatial factors into three main categories. We've got spatial skills, perceptual factors, and memory factors. What can you tell us about spatial skills?
Spatial skills, these are the abilities where you're actively doing something with spatial information in your mind. It's like taking that mental picture and manipulating it, transforming it to see how it changes. Like if you're trying to solve a Rubik's Cube in your head, you're picturing how those colors will move and shift with each twist. Or imagine trying to figure out how a flat sheet of cardboard will fold into a box.
So you're mentally manipulating objects, seeing how they change based on different actions or perspectives. Does that make sense? And the CHC theory actually includes a specific factor called visualization, or V, that fits this description perfectly.
It does. These is defined as the ability to perceive complex patterns and mentally simulate how they might look when transformed. So it's not just about seeing the pattern, it's about being able to imagine how it changes when you do something to it, when you rotate it, flip it, fold it, anything like that.
Okay, it's visualization. What about the next category, perceptual factors? How do those fit into spatial ability?
Perceptual factors. These are all about how we take in and process spatial information from the world around us. It's about how our visual system, how our brains register and interpret all those spatial details. Like think about depth perception, for example. Knowing how far away things are based on how they look.
Or even just recognizing shapes and patterns. That feels very fundamental.
Absolutely fundamental. And the review gives a great example from the CHC theory. It's a factor called perceptual alternations, or PN. Remember those optical illusions where you can see two different images depending on how you look at it?
Like the classic one where it's either a vase or two faces.
Exactly. Perceptual alteration is about how consistently and quickly your brain can switch between those two interpretations.
So it's not so much about actively manipulating the image, but more about how your brain initially processes that visual spatial information.
Right. It's about flexibility and perception, about being able to see things from different viewpoints or in different ways.
Okay, that's perceptual factors. What about the last category, memory factors?
Memory factors. These are all about how we hold on to spatial information, at least for a short period of time, in our working memory. Think of it like your brain's mental sketch pad.
So you see a complicated diagram,
Mm.
and you need to hold that image in your mind to understand the relationships between the parts.
Exactly. And the CHC theory includes a factor called visual memory, or MV, to capture this ability. The official definition is the ability to remember complex images over short periods of time, less than 30 seconds. So it's not about long-term memorization, it's about that immediate recall of visual spatial information.
So if you could hold that complex image in your mind for just long enough to work with it, to analyze it, to make connections, that's visual memory doing its job. Now, the review also brings up this interesting point about the whole nature versus nurture debate in relation to spatial ability. It mentions the work of Cheryl Sorby.
Right, Cheryl Sorby. She's done a ton of work on how to actually improve spatial abilities, particularly in engineering students. She makes this distinction between what she calls innate spatial ability, which is basically the raw potential you have without any specific training, and spatial skills, which are developed through practice and experience.
So some people might have this natural knack for spatial thinking, but even those who don't can still develop those skills through training.
That's the idea. And the review suggests we might think about this as innate spatial aptitude versus learned spatial ability to be more consistent with the terms that researchers use in the field. But the point is, whether you're born with a predisposition or you develop it through practice, spatial ability isn't fixed. You can get better at it.
That's really encouraging, especially for those who might feel like they struggle with spatial tasks. It means there's hope, there's room for improvement. Now, the CHC theory is a really useful framework for understanding intelligence in general, and spatial ability in particular. But the review suggests that it might not be the whole story. There's a lot of ongoing research that points to additional spatial factors that might not be fully captured by the current CHC model.
Right. The CHC theory is constantly evolving as we learn more. It's not like it's set in stone. And one of the things that researchers are really focusing on is what's called a splitter approach. This is all about getting more specific, about identifying those narrower, more granular abilities that make up spatial thinking.
So instead of just having a few big categories like visualization or spatial relations, we're trying to break those down into even smaller pieces, into more specialized skills.
Exactly. And the reason this is so important, especially for applying this research in education, is that it helps us understand exactly how spatial ability plays out in different learning contexts. If we can pinpoint those really specific spatial skills, we can tailor our teaching methods to better support those skills.
It makes sense. The more we understand about the individual components of spatial ability, the better equipped we are to help people develop those skills. So what are some of the criteria that researchers use to decide if something is a legitimate, distinct spatial factor?
The review lays out a few key guidelines. First, a genuine spatial factor should be pretty independent of your knowledge in other subjects. What that means is your understanding of, say, history shouldn't be the main reason you do well on a test of a specific spatial ability.
So it should be about your spatial thinking, not your knowledge of facts or concepts from other areas.
Right. It should be a measure of your spatial skill itself. Second, a new spatial factor should represent a unique cognitive process, something different from the abilities we've already identified. It can't just be a slight variation on something we already know about. It needs to be distinct to represent a separate mental process.
So we're looking for something truly new, something that adds to our understanding of how the spatial mind works.
Exactly. And the third criteria is that it should primarily involve visual information and spatial processes. That might seem obvious, but it's important to make sure we're really focusing on those core spatial elements.
So no sneaking in verbal reasoning or abstract thinking disguised as spatial abilities. It has to be about how we process visual and spatial information.
Precisely. We want to keep it pure to really isolate those spatial skills.
The review also gives a few examples of things that, based on these criteria, might not be considered purely spatial, like plotting points on a graph or figuring out directions using a compass. Why not?
Well, those tasks definitely have spatial aspects to them, no doubt. But the argument is that they might not be purely spatial because they rely on other things. Like plotting points often involves understanding coordinate systems, which is more about mathematical concepts than about spatial thinking itself.
So it's not just about seeing where something is in space. It's about using a specific system of representation.
Right. And with directions, while you're definitely thinking about space, you're often relying on knowledge of compass directions or landmarks. It's less about your raw ability to navigate and more about your familiarity with those specific cues.
So your knowledge of the environment can influence how well you do, even if you have strong spatial skills.
Exactly. And then there are those things called ecological spatial factors, which are basically abilities that are very closely tied to a particular environment. Like knowing your way around your own neighborhood is different from being able to navigate in a completely unfamiliar place.
So context matters. What might seem like a strong spatial ability in one setting might not translate to another if you're relying on specific knowledge of that environment.
Precisely. And the point is, while these are all important skills for navigating the world, they might not meet the strict definition of a fundamental context-independent spatial ability.
So we're drawing a line between those skills that are more about knowledge or familiarity with a particular setting and those that are about those core cognitive processes that allow us to think spatially, regardless of the specific environment.
Exactly. We're trying to get to the heart of spatial thinking, to those abilities that allow us to process spatial information in a flexible and generalizable way.
Okay, so we've talked about defining spatial ability
Mhm.
and the criteria for identifying new spatial factors. Now, there's one area that the review really highlights as potentially overlooked in those traditional models, and that's dynamic spatial ability.
Mm.
What exactly does that mean?
Dynamic spatial ability. This is all about spatial thinking when things are in motion. It's not just about visualizing static objects, it's about understanding movement, about tracking trajectories, predicting where things will go, how they'll interact.
So think about a basketball player trying to anticipate where the ball will go after it bounces off the backboard,
Yeah.
or a driver judging the speed and direction of other cars on the road.
Exactly. It's about that real-world dynamic aspect of spatial thinking. And the review points out that a lot of traditional spatial tests use static images, things on paper that don't move.
Yeah.
And the argument is that these tests might not be capturing the full picture of our dynamic spatial abilities.
It makes sense, right? The world is constantly moving, things are always changing. And to interact effectively with our environment, we need to be able to think spatially about those dynamic elements.
Yeah.
It seems almost more fundamental than just dealing with static images.
It really does. And researchers have been talking about this for a while. Back in the 90s, Larson wrote about this, and even earlier, Pellegrino and his colleagues were making this point, arguing that we can't just rely on those static assessments to understand the full range of our spatial abilities.
So there's been this awareness that dynamic spatial ability is important, but it hasn't always been given the same attention as those more traditional static abilities.
Right. But research in this area is growing, and we're getting a clearer picture of what dynamic spatial ability actually involves.
Now, the review mentions some debate about whether dynamic ability is truly spatial or if it's more about our sense of timing, about those temporal processing skills. How do we tease those apart?
Yeah, that's a valid question. Some researchers, Kylan and Chekin, for example, have argued that a lot of those tasks that involve predicting motion, like figuring out where a ball will land or when a car will arrive at a certain point, might actually be tapping into your sense of time and rhythm more than your spatial abilities.
So it's not just about where something is in space, it's about when it will get there.
Right. And that sense of timing might be a separate cognitive skill from spatial processing. However, other studies have found connections between those dynamic ability tests and those more traditional static spatial tasks, suggesting that there is some overlap, that spatial skills do play a role in those dynamic judgments.
So the question becomes how much of it is timing and how much of it is spatial thinking?
Exactly. And the review suggests that maybe we can think of dynamic spatial ability as kind of a hybrid, where you're applying those perceptual and memory-related abilities, those spatial skills, to stimuli that are moving. So timing definitely plays a role, but it's not the whole story. There's a spatial component as well.
It's about integrating those two things, time and space, to make accurate judgments about moving objects.
Precisely. And there's even some biological evidence to support this idea. Researchers have found neurons in the brain that are specifically sensitive to motion, suggesting that there are dedicated neural pathways for processing this kind of information.
So our brains are wired to think spatially about movement.
It seems that way.
The review then delves into the evidence that suggests that dynamic and static spatial abilities are actually distinct, that they might be separate skills. It mentions some early research using motion pictures to study this.
Right. Way back in the 1950s, Roth did this cool study using factor analysis on tests that involved motion pictures. And he actually identified a factor that he called movement time.
Movement time, what did that encompass?
It involved things like judging the direction of movement and being able to integrate different views of an object as it moved. They weren't using the term dynamic spatial ability back then, but these tests seem to be tapping into those same skills that we're studying today.
So even back then, researchers were starting to tease apart those dynamic aspects of spatial thinking.
They were. And later, as computers became more powerful and sophisticated, researchers like Hunt and Pellegrino were able to investigate dynamic spatial ability more precisely. They designed these computer-based tests specifically to assess these dynamic factors, and their analyses showed pretty convincingly that these abilities were distinct from those static spatial abilities.
So the evidence for a separate dynamic spatial ability started to mount.
It did. And more recent studies by Contreras in 2003 and D'Oliveira in 2004 further supported this distinction. They identified independent dynamic factors related to jugging direction, something called arrival time, which is your ability to predict when a moving object will reach a certain point, and a really interesting one called intercept judgment.
Intercept judgment, that sounds like a skill you'd need in a lot of sports.
Exactly. It's about figuring out where a moving object will be when you need to interact with it. Think about catching a ball or hitting a tennis ball. You need to judge the trajectory and the timing perfectly to make contact.
So we're getting this clear picture of dynamic spatial ability as something more than just mental rotation applied to moving objects. It's about a whole set of skills that are specific to understanding and interacting with things in motion.
Right. It's about predicting trajectories, judging speeds and directions, anticipating how objects will move and interact. It's a complex skill set, and it's crucial for a lot of real-world tasks.
And the review even suggests that we might need to consider dynamic versions of some of those existing CHC factors, like visual memory and spatial scanning.
Yeah, that's a really cool idea. If we have static visual memory, like remembering a still image, why not dynamic visual memory?
So instead of holding a single image in mind, you're remembering a sequence of moving images, like a mental video clip.
Exactly. Or with spatial scanning, which is the ability to visually search for something in a complex scene, what about dynamic spatial scanning? being able to track a moving target while also taking in the surrounding information.
It seems like a whole new frontier of spatial ability research is opening up as we start to explore these dynamic counterparts to those more traditional static abilities.
Yes, it really does. And it makes sense, right? So much of our world is dynamic. So much of what we do involves interacting with things in motion. Understanding how our brains handle that spatial information is going to be crucial for understanding how we learn, how we solve problems, and how we navigate the world.
Okay, so we've gotten pretty deep into dynamic spatial ability. Now let's move on to a classic area in spatial ability research: mental rotation. The review talks about its strong link to STEM success, and then it delves into this interesting distinction between mental rotation and spatial orientation.
Right, mental rotation. That's the classic one, the ability to mentally rotate objects in your mind. And it's definitely a superstar when it comes to predicting how well people will do in STEM. We have all these psychometric tests like the card rotations test or CRT, where you have to quickly figure out which images are rotated versions of a target shape, and the Purdue spatial visualization test. Rotations, or PSVTR, which involves more complex 3D objects and puts less emphasis on speed.
So both of those tests are getting at this core ability to mentally manipulate objects in space.
They are. And then we have spatial orientation, which sounds similar but is subtly different.
What's the difference?
Spatial orientation is more about your ability to understand how things look from different viewpoints. It's like mentally putting yourself in a different spot and seeing how the scene changes. Tests like the Perspective Taking Spatial Orientation Test, or PTSOT, are often used to measure this ability.
So with mental rotation, you're rotating the object in your mind. With spatial orientation, you're rotating yourself, or at least your perspective, within the scene.
Exactly. And for a long time, there's been this debate in the research about whether spatial orientation is truly a distinct skill from mental rotation, or if it's just a variation on the same underlying ability.
Like maybe people who are good at mentally rotating objects are also good at imagining different perspectives.
Right. But the review points to some research that suggests that these might actually be separate skills. Hegarty and Waller, back in 2004, did a study that provided some evidence for this. They found that perspective taking, what they call egocentric spatial transformation, basically, thinking about how the world appears from your point of view, is different from object-based mental rotation, or allocentric spatial transformation, which is about the spatial relationships between objects.
So egocentric is about you as the viewer.
Yeah.
Allocentric is about the objects themselves.
Exactly. And that makes sense, right? It's one thing to be able to rotate a chair in your mind, but it's another thing to imagine yourself sitting in that chair and how the room would look from that vantage point.
It's like the difference between being the director and being the actor in the scene.
Perfect analogy. And then in 2014, Wang and his colleagues did this big meta-analysis where they combined data from a bunch of different studies on mental rotation and spatial orientation. And their results supported Hegarty and Waller's findings. They found that perspective taking seems to be a separate skill from object-based mental rotation.
So two different studies using different methods, both pointing to distinction between mental rotation and spatial orientation.
Right. And based on that growing body of evidence, the review suggests that it's probably a good idea to include a separate spatial orientation, or SO, factor in our understanding of spatial ability. It seems like it's its own thing, not just a subset of mental rotation.
Okay, so we have mental rotation, we have spatial orientation. The review also briefly mentions large-scale spatial ability, like navigation. How does that fit in?
Navigation is a tricky one. It's obviously a really important skill in the real world, but the review suggests that it's probably not a single unified cognitive factor. Instead, it likely involves a combination of several of those first-order factors we've already talked about.
So it's more like a complex skill that draws on multiple spatial abilities.
Right. It might involve your ability to take different perspectives, like spatial orientation. It definitely involves your memory for spatial layouts, remembering where things are in relation to each other. And it also draws on those general spatial skills, like visualization and mental rotation, to help you plan routes and imagine different paths.
So being good at navigation is kind of like being a spatial all-star. You need a whole toolkit of spatial abilities to do it well.
Exactly. It's a multifaceted skill that draws on a lot of different cognitive resources.
Now let's go back to mental rotation for a moment. The review brings up a really interesting question. Should we even be distinguishing between 2D and 3D mental rotation as separate factors?
Ah, yes, the 2D versus 3D debate. It's a lively one in the research world. Remember those tests we talked about, the CRT with those simple 2D shapes and the PSVTR with those more complex 3D objects? Well, some researchers have argued that these might actually be tapping into different aspects of mental rotation.
So it's not just about the complexity of the objects. It's about something more fundamental about how we process 2D versus 3D information.
That's the idea. Harlan Towns did a great summary of the research on this, and then there was a really interesting training study by Moreau that suggested a possible hierarchy here.
A hierarchy, what do you mean?
Well, their findings suggested that the ability to quickly rotate those 2D shapes might be more about processing speed, like how quickly your brain can take in and manipulate that visual information, whereas the ability to mentally rotate those 3D objects might reflect more of a fundamental spatial power, like your ability to handle complexity, to imagine those rotations in 3 dimensions.
So 2D mental rotation might be more about speed, and 3D mental rotation might be more about power. That's a really cool distinction.
It is, but whether these are truly distinct underlying abilities, given how the CHC theory is currently structured, is still a question that's up for debate. More research is definitely needed to tease this apart.
It's always fascinating how these seemingly straightforward abilities, like mental rotation, can actually be so nuanced and complex when you really dig into the research. And it highlights how much we still don't know about how the brain works, how we think and process information.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that we're always learning, always refining our understanding.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground with spatial skills, perceptual factors, dynamic spatial ability, mental rotation, spatial orientation. Now, the review moves into the areas of imagery and perception, specifically discussing those existing CHC factors for imagery, or IM, and perceptual illusions, or PI. And it suggests that there might be more to the story than those single factors capture.
Right. The CHC theory, in its current form, has just one imagery factor, which is defined as your ability to create and manipulate mental images of things that aren't physically present. But some researchers have argued that this might be too broad, that there are actually sub-factors within imagery that deserve their own attention.
So instead of just one big imagery bucket, we might need to separate it into different types or aspects of imagery.
Exactly. And Burton and Fogarty, back in 2003, did a study that identified some potential sub-factors. They found evidence for things like imagery quality, which is about the vividness and detail of those mental images, and imagery speed, which is about how quickly you can generate and manipulate those images. They also found a factor related to how people rate their own imagery abilities, but the review points out that this might just be about someone's subjective belief, not their actual skill. Like someone might think they have great mental imagery, but when you test them, it's not actually that strong.
It's like that saying, don't believe everything you think. Your perception of your own abilities isn't always accurate.
Precisely. And that's why it's so important to have those objective measures, those tests that can really assess those cognitive skills.
So we might need to expand our understanding of imagery beyond just that single CHC factor. What about perceptual illusions? The CHC also just has one factor for that, right?
Right. Perceptual illusions, or PI, in the CHC framework, refers to your ability to not be fooled by visual illusions when you're processing information. But a study by Corin and his colleagues back in the 1970s suggested that there might actually be multiple factors at play here. They found evidence for as many as 5 distinct factors based on different types of illusions.
5 different types of illusions.
I
What are
don't
some
know.
examples?